My name is Mallory. I'm 34 years old, and 3 weeks ago I got a phone call that shattered everything I thought I knew about family. My mother's voice was cold and matter of fact when she told me that my two children, 7-year-old Sophie and 5-year-old Lucas, were banned from my sister Bethany's wedding. Not invited. Not welcome. The reason? They would apparently ruin the sophisticated atmosphere Bethany wanted for her big day. I stood there in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, feeling like someone had punched me in the stomach. My kids weren't misbehaved. They weren't wild or uncontrollable. They were just children who loved their aunt and had been so excited to be part of her special day. But in that moment, staring at the wedding invitation on my fridge with their names conspicuously absent, I realized this wasn't really about the wedding at all. This was the culmination of 34 years of being the forgotten daughter, the one who never quite measured up, the one whose feelings never seemed to matter. And right then, I made a decision that would change everything. Before we dive into what happened next, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below and tell me if you've ever dealt with family favoritism. If this story resonates with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what I did in return. Trust me, you'll want to hear how this unfolds. Now, let's get into the whole messy, painful, and ultimately liberating story of how I finally stood up to my family. Growing up, I always knew Bethany was the favorite. It wasn't something anyone explicitly said, but you could feel it in every interaction, every decision, every family moment. She was 3 years younger than me, born with this effortless charm that made our parents beam with pride. I can still remember being 13 years old, working hard to get straight A's in school, only to have my report card glanced at briefly before being set aside. But when Bethany brought home a B+ in art class at age 10, our mother Patricia hung the accompanying painting in the living room like it was a masterpiece destined for a museum. The pattern continued relentlessly through our teenage years and into adulthood, growing more pronounced with each passing milestone. When Bethany turned 16, our parents surprised her with a brand new Honda Civic, complete with a big red bow in the driveway. I remember watching from my bedroom window as she squealed with delight, and our father Howard lifted her off her feet in a bear hug. 3 years earlier, when I had turned 16, I'd been told I could share the family's aging sedan, a vehicle that was already 10 years old and constantly breaking down. I was expected to be grateful for even that. The college years brought an even starker contrast. Bethany was accepted to an expensive private university with a renowned arts program, and our parents paid her entire tuition without hesitation, covering her dorm fees, meal plans, and even giving her a generous monthly allowance for entertainment. Meanwhile, I had attended community college for 2 years before transferring to a state school, taking out student loans that I was still paying off a decade later. When I'd asked for help with tuition, my father had told me that nursing school was a practical choice, and I should be able to afford it with scholarships and part-time work. Bethany's art degree, on the other hand, was constantly praised as a promising career path, even though Shed never actually pursued art professionally after graduation. My wedding to Garrett 8 years ago had been a small, budget-conscious affair. We'd saved for months, kept the guest list under 70 people, and held both the ceremony and reception at a local community center to save money. My parents had contributed a modest $1,500 and spent the entire planning process suggesting ways we could cut costs further. Patricia had actually told me that simple weddings were more meaningful anyway, that we didn't need to waste money on fancy venues or expensive flowers. I'd believed her at the time, convinced myself that she was right, and that Garrett and I were building something authentic and real. We'd been happy on our wedding day despite the limitations, surrounded by friends who genuinely cared about us. But now, 8 years later, watching my parents pour over $60,000 into Bethany's upcoming wedding to Preston, a corporate lawyer from a wealthy Connecticut family, the hypocrisy was impossible to ignore. Every week brought news of another extravagant detail: the designer wedding gown that cost more than my entire wedding budget, the destination bachelorette party in Napa Valley, the custom invitations with gold leaf edges, the 12-piece live band for the reception. Through all of this, I'd kept my mouth shut and swallowed my hurt. I'd told myself that being the bigger person meant not keeping score, that love wasn't about money or attention, that I should be happy for my sister. My children Sophie and Lucas absolutely adored their Aunt Bethany. She was fun and spontaneous in a way I'd never been allowed to be, swooping in for occasional visits bearing gifts and enthusiasm before disappearing back into her child-free life. When the wedding invitation had arrived 6 months ago, Sophie had been thrilled to see her name listed as a potential flower girl. Lucas had practiced walking slowly and carrying a pillow for weeks, so proud of the idea that he might be the ring bearer. I'd spent $200 on a beautiful dress for Sophie, navy blue with delicate embroidery, and a tiny suit for Lucas that made him look heartbreakingly grown up. They'd hung in the closet for months, waiting for the big day. Then came that phone call 3 weeks before the wedding. Patricia's voice had been crisp and businesslike, as though she were discussing a grocery list rather than excluding her own grandchildren from a family event. "Mallory, I need to talk to you about the wedding," she'd begun, and I'd actually felt a flutter of hope that maybe she was calling to ask if Sophie and Lucas needed any special accommodations or meal preferences. Instead, Shed continued without preamble. "Bethany has decided she wants an adult-only affair. It's going to be quite sophisticated, very elegant, and she's concerned that young children might disrupt the atmosphere. Your kids are still quite young, and you know how unpredictable they can be. We're sure you understand. It's nothing personal, just about maintaining the right tone for the event." I'd stood there in stunned silence, trying to process what I was hearing. Nothing personal? My children were being rejected, deemed unworthy of attending their aunt's wedding, and I was supposed to understand? I'd tried to argue, explaining that Sophie and Lucas were well behaved, that they'd been looking forward to this for months, that family should be more important than some arbitrary standard of sophistication. Patricia had cut me off firmly, her voice taking on that edge it always got when she was done discussing something. "The decision is made, Mallory. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." I'd immediately called my father, hoping he might be more reasonable, that he might actually stand up for his grandchildren. Howard had been even worse in some ways, his tone dismissive and slightly irritated that I was bothering him at work. "Your mother and I support Bethany's vision for her day," Head said flatly. "She's worked very hard planning this wedding, and she deserves to have it exactly as she wants." "You always were too sensitive about these things, Mallory. Just get a babysitter for the kids, and come enjoy yourself as an adult for once." The implication hung heavy in the air. I was being unreasonable. I was being difficult. I was failing to prioritize my sister's happiness over my own hurt feelings. This was the first real attack, the opening salvo in what would become an escalating campaign of emotional manipulation and dismissal. But at that moment, standing in my kitchen with tears streaming down my face, I didn't yet realize this was only the beginning. 1 week after the devastating phone call, just as I was starting to process my hurt and anger, Bethany called me with a request that felt like salt in an open wound. Her voice was bright and cheerful, completely oblivious to or unconcerned about the pain she'd caused. "Hey Mal, I need a huge favor," she chirped. "I'm so behind on wedding DIY projects, and I was hoping you could come over to Mom and Dad's place this weekend to help. We need to finish the centerpieces, address about 200 invitations, and assemble the welcome bags for out-of-town guests." "You're so good at that kind of detailed work." I felt anger surge through me like electricity. She wanted me to spend my precious weekend doing unpaid labor for a wedding that my children weren't even allowed to attend? The audacity was breathtaking. I took a breath and responded as calmly as I could manage. "Actually, Bethany, I don't think I can do that. I have plans with Sophie and Lucas." The silence on the other end of the line lasted maybe 3 seconds before Bethany's tone shifted completely. "Are you serious right now?" she demanded, her voice rising. "This is my wedding, Mallory. My one special day. And you're going to be petty and refuse to help me because you're mad about the kid situation? That's really mature." I tried to explain that it wasn't about being petty, that I was hurt and needed some space, but Shed already hung up on me. 20 minutes later, my phone rang again. It was Patricia, and she was furious in a way I rarely heard, her words coming out in a torrent of accusation and guilt. "How dare you refuse to help your sister?" she hissed into the phone. "After everything we've done for you over the years, this is how you repay us?" By being selfish and vindictive during the most important time in Bethany's life? You're going to ruin her wedding with your attitude. The second attack had landed perfectly, striking right at my deepest fear that maybe I was the problem, maybe I was being unreasonable. I caved almost immediately, hating myself for it even as I agreed. That weekend, I drove to my parents' house while Garrett stayed home with Sophie and Lucas, who kept asking why they couldn't come see Grandma and Grandpa. I didn't have a good answer for them. The house was transformed into Wedding Central, with samples and supplies covering every surface. Bethany was in full bride mode, directing operations with the intensity of a military general, while Patricia hovered nearby, ready to fulfill her every need. I was given a folding table in the corner of the dining room and handed a stack of invitation envelopes that seemed impossibly tall. "Make sure your handwriting is neat," Patricia instructed. "These are going to very important people in Preston's family. We can't have them looking sloppy." I spent 6 hours that Saturday and another 5 on Sunday writing addresses in my neatest script until my hand cramped, taking breaks only when Bethany deemed it acceptable. During a break on Sunday afternoon, I walked past the partially open door to the living room and heard voices. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but what I heard made me freeze in place. Bethany was laughing. That particular laugh she had when she was being mean-spirited but trying to pass it off as humor. "I mean, can you imagine if Mallory's kids were actually at the wedding?" she was saying. "Lucas would probably run screaming down the aisle during the vows, and Sophie would definitely have some kind of meltdown. They're so undisciplined. It'd literally die of embarrassment in front of Preston's family." My mother's response was even worse. She laughed along, not even trying to defend her grandchildren. "You made absolutely the right call, sweetheart," Patricia agreed enthusiastically. "Mallory never did learn how to properly control those children. They're sweet enough, I suppose, but they have no sense of appropriate behavior. It's probably for the best that they're not there. Can you imagine the photos? We don't need Lucas picking his nose in the background of your first dance." The third attack hit me like a physical blow, this first major betrayal cutting deeper than anything that had come before. My children weren't just being excluded. They were being actively mocked and criticized behind my back by people who were supposed to love them unconditionally. Sophie and Lucas were genuinely well-behaved kids. Sophie was thoughtful and quiet, always concerned about following rules and making people happy. Lucas was energetic but responsive to direction, the kind of kid who might need reminders but never deliberately misbehaved. This wasn't about their actual behavior. This was pure cruelty disguised as wedding planning. I walked into the living room, my hands still stained with ink from addressing envelopes. Both Bethany and Patricia looked up, startled. "I heard what you just said," I told them quietly, trying to keep my voice steady even though I was shaking. "About my children. About how undisciplined they supposedly are." For a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd feel ashamed. Maybe they'd apologize and acknowledge that they'd crossed a line. Instead, Bethany rolled her eyes dramatically, and Patricia's expression hardened into defensive irritation. "Oh, don't be so sensitive," Bethany said dismissively. "We were just joking around. You know we love Sophie and Lucas, but you have to admit, they're a lot to handle sometimes." Patricia jumped in quickly, her tone taking on that false reasonableness that always preceded her most effective manipulation. "You're taking things the wrong way, honey. We were simply discussing the logistics of the wedding. You always do this, Mallory. You take innocent comments and twist them into something hurtful. Maybe you should think about why you're so defensive about this." The gaslighting was masterful. Within minutes, they'd managed to make me question my own ears, my own interpretation of what I'd clearly heard. I left shortly after, claiming a headache, and cried the entire drive home. When I told Garrett what had happened, he was furious in a way I rarely saw him. He wanted to call my parents immediately and tell them exactly what he thought of their treatment of our family. He suggested we skip the wedding entirely, cut contact, protect our children from people who clearly didn't value them. Part of me desperately wanted to agree, to just walk away and never look back. But another part of me, the part that had been conditioned for 34 years to seek my parents' approval, couldn't quite let go. I told Garrett I needed to think about it. that maybe things would get better, that confronting them would only make things worse. He reluctantly agreed to let me handle it my way, though I could see the disappointment in his eyes. Over the next few days, I discovered something that made the situation even more infuriating. Through casual conversations with various relatives, I learned that several other family members were absolutely bringing their children to the wedding. My cousin Iris, who had 3 kids all under the age of 6, had received no such ban. Her children were notoriously rowdy, the kind of kids who ran through restaurants and threw tantrums in stores, but apparently they were perfectly acceptable guests at this sophisticated adult affair. The hypocrisy was stunning and undeniable. This wasn't about maintaining an elegant atmosphere. This was about specifically excluding my children, about making sure I understood exactly where we ranked in the family hierarchy. 2 weeks before the wedding, I found myself standing in my parents' backyard at Bethany's bridal shower, wondering how I'd let myself be talked into this nightmare. I'd arranged for Garrett's parents to watch Sophie and Lucas for the afternoon, paying a babysitter I couldn't really afford so that I could attend this celebration of my sister's perfect life. I'd brought an expensive gift, a set of designer kitchen appliances that Bethany had registered for, purchased with money that should have gone towards Sophie's upcoming dental work. The backyard was decorated beautifully with white and gold balloons, elegant table settings, and a catering spread that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Patricia's friends were there in force, along with various family members and Bethany's social circle. I plastered on a smile and tried to blend into the background, hoping to get through the afternoon without incident. Then came the speeches. Various people stood up to toast Bethany and share stories about her wonderful qualities. Bethany's college roommate talked about her creativity. Preston's sister praised her elegance and sophistication. Then Patricia stood, champagne glass in hand, and delivered what felt like a targeted missile aimed directly at my heart. "I'm so blessed to be mother to this incredible woman," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "Bethany has always been my perfect daughter, the one who understands class and elegance, who knows how to conduct herself with grace in any situation. Some daughters just have that natural refinement, that innate understanding of how things should be done." She paused meaningfully, her eyes flickering toward me for just a moment before continuing. "Preston, you're getting such a treasure. A woman who knows the value of keeping up appearances and maintaining standards. I couldn't be prouder." The 4th attack landed perfectly. Everyone in that backyard knew exactly who she was talking about when she referenced daughters who lacked refinement. Several of Patricia's friends glanced at me with expressions ranging from pity to smug satisfaction. I felt my face burn with humiliation, but the worst was yet to come. Bethany's maid of honor, a woman named Cynthia, who I'd always thought was relatively friendly toward me, stood up with her own glass of champagne and a smile that looked almost predatory. "So I have to ask," she said loudly, projecting her voice across the entire gathering. "Mallory, I heard your kids aren't coming to the wedding? That must be such a relief for you, right? I mean, kids can be such a handful at these events, constantly needing attention, making noise, disrupting things. You'll probably have so much more fun without having to worry about them." The laughter that followed was like knives. Not everyone laughed, but enough people did to make it clear this had been orchestrated, planned specifically to humiliate me in front of this assembled audience. This was the 5th attack, the second major betrayal, and it broke something inside me. Cynthia had never been my close friend, but I'd thought she was at least neutral, someone who would never deliberately cause me pain. Clearly, I'd been wrong. She'd been recruited into this campaign of cruelty, probably at Bethany's direction. I mumbled something about needing to use the bathroom and fled into the house. I barely made it to the powder room before the tears came, silent sobs that shook my whole body as I gripped the edge of the sink and tried not to completely fall apart. This was supposed to be a celebration, a happy family occasion, and instead I was hiding in a bathroom while people laughed at the exclusion of my children. I seriously considered leaving right then, walking out to my car and never speaking to any of these people again. I imagined the relief of just cutting them all off, of protecting Sophie and Lucas from ever having to interact with grandparents who viewed them as embarrassments. But even in my pain, I felt paralyzed by decades of conditioning, unable to take that final step of walking away. A soft knock on the door made me freeze. "Honey, it's Francine," came my aunt's gentle voice. Can I come in? I unlocked the door and let her slip inside, this woman who had always been kinder to me than my own mother. Francine was Patricia's older sister, a widow in her late 60s who had raised 3 children of her own and had never been one to tolerate nonsense. She took one look at my tear-stained face and pulled me into a firm hug. I've been watching this favoritism play out for years, she told me quietly. What your parents are doing is disgusting. What your sister is doing is cruel. And what just happened out there with that Cynthia woman was calculated and vicious. You don't deserve this treatment, Mallory. Your children certainly don't deserve it. Her words were like oxygen to a drowning person. Someone saw it. Someone acknowledged it. I wasn't crazy or oversensitive or dramatic. Francine pulled back and looked me directly in the eyes. You don't owe them anything, she said firmly. Not your labor, not your presence, and certainly not your continued tolerance of their abuse. Your children are wonderful, well-behaved, sweet kids. This whole situation is about control and about your mother's need to make Bethany the center of the universe at everyone else's expense. You have every right to set boundaries. Sometimes you have to set boundaries, even with family. Especially with family. She became my first real ally in this nightmare, planting a seed that would grow into action. After our talk, I washed my face, fixed my makeup, and returned to the shower with a new coldness settling over me. I stayed for the rest of the event but participated minimally, speaking only when directly addressed and offering nothing more than polite pleasantries. I could feel Patricia watching me nervously, probably worried I might cause a scene, but I gave her nothing to complain about. I simply existed in that space, detached and observing, already beginning to formulate a plan. On the drive home, something fundamental shifted inside me. I realized I would not just skip the wedding and fade quietly into the background. I would make a statement. One that would force my family to face consequences for their treatment of me and my children. That night, after Sophie and Lucas were tucked into bed, Garrett and I sat at our kitchen table and had the longest, most honest conversation we'd had in months. Had seen me come home from the bridal shower looking different, harder somehow, and he knew something significant had shifted. I told him everything that had happened, including the encounter with Francine and the realization I'd had on the drive home. Garrett's immediate suggestion was simple and appealing. Let's just cut them off, he said, reaching across the table to take my hand. They don't deserve you, Mal. They don't deserve access to our kids. We can build a life completely separate from them and be so much happier. I understood the appeal of that approach. It would be clean and final, a door closed forever. But as I sat there thinking about it, I realized that simply disappearing wouldn't be enough. They needed to understand the pain they'd caused. They needed to face consequences that couldn't be ignored or rationalized away. I started considering various options, running through scenarios in my mind like a chess player planning several moves ahead. I could simply not attend the wedding, but that felt too passive. Patricia would just tell everyone I was being petty and difficult, and the narrative would be completely under their control. I could confront them again privately, but we'd already established that they would just gaslight me and twist my words until I questioned my own reality. I could cause a scene at the wedding itself, but that felt too aggressive and might hurt other family members who had nothing to do with this situation. None of these options felt right. Then, slowly, a plan began to take shape. What if I attended the wedding but used the opportunity to calmly and publicly expose the hypocrisy and favoritism? Not in a screaming confrontational way, but in a way that was dignified and undeniable? I spent the next several days researching and refining this idea. I discovered that the wedding venue, photographer, and catering company all had public review pages online. I learned that several relatives had been asking various family members why Sophie and Lucas weren't in the wedding party, suggesting that not everyone was comfortable with their exclusion. Most importantly, I realized that wedding receptions typically had an open microphone period during toasts, a built-in opportunity to speak that wouldn't require me to interrupt or cause a disruption. The more I thought about it, the more perfect it seemed. I would give a speech during the official toast period, using calm and factual language to lay out exactly what had happened. I would expose the favoritism with specific examples that couldn't be denied. Then I would leave immediately, cutting contact and making it clear that this wasn't just empty words but a permanent boundary. Garrett's sister Blanche turned out to be my second crucial ally. She was a family lawyer with a sharp mind and a fierce protective streak when it came to people she loved. When I told her what I was planning, she didn't try to talk me out of it. Instead, she offered practical advice that would prove invaluable. Document everything, she instructed firmly. Save every text message. If it's legal in your state to record phone calls without the other party's consent, do it. Keep receipts, keep emails, keep everything. Your family is going to try to rewrite history after this happens. They're going to claim you're lying or exaggerating or being dramatic. You need evidence. I followed her advice meticulously. I went through my phone and created a backup folder of every text message from Patricia, Howard, and Bethany over the past 6 months. I saved the original wedding invitation that had conspicuously excluded my children. I even recorded a phone call with Patricia about picking up wedding supplies, just to have documentation of the tone she used with me. Then came an interaction that added fuel to my fire and helped me refine my plan even further. Patricia called demanding that I pick up Bethany's wedding dress from the alterations shop, another errand being assigned to me without any regard for my time or feelings. I agreed, maintaining the facade that everything was normal. At the dress shop, I ran into a family friend named Ramona, a woman who had known me since I was a child. She seemed uncomfortable when she saw me, shifting her weight and avoiding eye contact. Finally, she said something that made my blood run cold. "I'm so glad Bethany decided to keep the wedding adults only," Ramona told me quietly, her tone sympathetic but filled with pity. "Your mother told me about your children's behavioral issues. That must be so difficult for you to deal with. I can understand why it's better they're not at the wedding. You shouldn't feel bad about it." This was the 6th attack, and the 3rd major betrayal rolled into one devastating moment. My parents hadn't just excluded my children. They'd been actively lying to people about them, spreading false information to justify their decision and make themselves look reasonable. They were destroying my children's reputation to cover their own cruelty. I corrected Ramona gently, explaining that Sophie and Lucas didn't have behavioral issues, that they were actually very well-behaved children, and that the exclusion had nothing to do with their conduct. I could see the confusion and dawning realization in her eyes as she processed this information. She apologized profusely, clearly embarrassed that she'd been misled. But the damage was done, and I now knew that this campaign against my family was even more extensive than I'd realized. My parents were willing to lie to their friends and community to maintain their narrative. This revelation transformed my plan from a personal statement into something more public and necessary. I refined my approach. I would still give the speech at the wedding reception, but afterward, I would also post a detailed and dignified account on social media for extended family members who weren't present. I would give people the opportunity to hear the truth and make their own judgments. I would attach documentation where appropriate, backing up my claims with evidence. This wasn't about revenge in the petty sense. This was about refusing to let them control the narrative any longer. This was about protecting my children from lies and ensuring that everyone knew the truth. The final week before the wedding was almost surreal in its tension. On the surface, I played the role of supportive sister and dutiful daughter perfectly. Internally, I was counting down the days until I could finally speak my truth and walk away from this toxic dynamic forever. 7 days before the wedding, Bethany called in a panic. Her preferred florist had apparently canceled due to a family emergency, and she was devastated. "I don't know what to do," she wailed into the phone. "Everything is ruined. The flowers were supposed to be perfect and now I have nothing." Patricia immediately called me, as I'd known she would, demanding that I spend the entire day calling backup florists to find someone who could accommodate Bethany's specific vision on such short notice. Under normal circumstances, I might have pushed back or at least negotiated, but now I agreed readily. Every task they gave me was another piece of evidence, another example I could cite in my speech about how they'd expected my unpaid labor while excluding my children from the celebration. I spent 6 hours on the phone that day, working my way through every florist in a 50-mile radius, explaining Bethany's requirements, and trying to find someone available. I finally located a florist willing to take on the last-minute job for a premium fee, and I coordinated all the details myself. When I called Bethany with the good news, she was thrilled but didn't once say thank you. She just launched into a detailed description of exactly how the arrangements should look and made me promise to follow up with the florist to confirm every detail. I did it all with secret satisfaction, knowing that this would be one of the final examples in my speech of the imbalanced relationship that had defined our entire lives. 3 days before the wedding, my father called me with what he presented as a generous peace offering. His tone was almost conciliatory, which immediately put me on guard because Howard rarely showed anything resembling contrition. "Your mother and I have been talking," he began carefully. "We know you've been upset about the situation with Sophie and Lucas. We think maybe we can find a compromise." My heart actually leaped for a moment, a conditioned response from years of desperately seeking their approval and validation. Maybe they'd actually recognized how hurtful their decision was. Maybe they were going to invite my children after all, but of course, that's not what he was offering. We thought maybe, just maybe, if Sophie and Lucas promised to be on their absolute best behavior, they could attend the ceremony itself. Howard continued. Just the ceremony, you understand. Not the reception, because that's really the sophisticated part that Bethany is most concerned about. But they could come to the church, sit quietly in the back, and at least be present for the actual wedding. What do you think? The offer was presented as though it were magnanimous, a huge concession on their part. In reality, it was insulting on multiple levels. It still excluded my children from the family celebration. It still required them to prove their worthiness through perfect behavior. And it was being offered 3 days before the event as though I should be grateful for this last-minute scrap. I took a deep breath and surprised myself with how calm my voice sounded when I responded. "Actually, Dad, I think your and Mom's original instinct was correct," I said evenly. "It's better if Sophie and Lucas don't attend at all. I wouldn't want them to accidentally ruin anything." "Well, stick with the original plan." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, as though Howard hadn't expected this response. Then his relief was almost palpable in his voice. "Well, if you're sure," he said quickly. "We certainly don't want you to feel pressured either way. If you think it's for the best, then I'm sure that's the right decision." He practically couldn't hang up fast enough, clearly thrilled that he could report back to Patricia that the children would definitely not be attending. That conversation confirmed something crucial for me. They'd never actually wanted to include Sophie and Lucas. The offer had been purely performative, made so they could claim they'd tried to compromise if anyone questioned them later. The fact that Howard was relieved when I declined proved that this had always been about exclusion, not about any legitimate concerns. The night before the wedding, there was a family dinner at my parents' house for out-of-town relatives who had arrived early. I attended with Garrett, leaving Sophie and Lucas with his parents once again. The dinner was exactly what I'd expected. Bethany held court like a queen, surrounded by admiring relatives praising every aspect of the upcoming wedding. Preston's family was there, looking polished and elegant in a way that made our side of the family seem almost rustic by comparison. Patricia was in her element, playing the role of proud mother of the bride with theatrical precision. During the meal, my cousin Iris pulled me aside into the hallway, her expression oddly intense. What she told me next revealed the hidden villain I hadn't even known existed. "I need to get something off my chest," Iris said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "I'm the one who told your mom that your kids were problematic. Last Christmas, when we were all together, I mentioned to Patricia that Sophie seemed whiny and Lucas was too energetic. I might have exaggerated a bit." I stared at her, trying to process this confession. "Why would you do that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Iris had the grace to look ashamed, but only slightly. "Honestly, I was jealous," she admitted. "Your kids are actually way better behaved than mine, and people were starting to make comments about it. My 3 are kind of wild, and I got tired of hearing about how well-mannered Sophie and Lucas were in comparison. So I planted some seeds with your mom about how they might not be as perfect as they seemed. I didn't think she'd actually ban them from the wedding. I just wanted to level the playing field a little." This betrayal from someone I'd considered neutral, someone I'd never suspected of working against me, was almost worse than the attacks from my immediate family. It revealed how deep and widespread the dysfunction ran, how willing people were to sabotage each other for petty reasons. I looked at Iris for a long moment, seeing her clearly for the first time. Then I simply walked away without responding. There was nothing to say to someone who would deliberately harm children to make herself feel better about her own parenting. Back in the dining room, Bethany was in full bridezilla mode, snapping at one of Preston's aunts about the seating chart and complaining that the party favors Shed ordered weren't exactly the right shade of ivory. Patricia soothed her constantly while ignoring everyone else in the room. I watched it all with a detached clarity, as though I were studying a play rather than participating in real life. These people would never change unless forced to confront their behavior. They were so comfortable in their patterns of favoritism and cruelty that they didn't even see it anymore. As the evening wound down and Garrett and I prepared to leave, Patricia handed me a printed list with a sweet smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Tomorrow's day of tasks for you," she announced cheerfully. "You'll need to be at the venue by 5 in the morning to help set up decorations. Then there's the welcome table to organize, the gift table to arrange, and someone needs to make sure the guest book is properly positioned with pens that work. Since your children won't be there, you'll have plenty of time to help." This seventh attack was almost funny in its brazenness. She was literally assigning me pre-dawn manual labor while my children sat at home excluded from the celebration. I looked at the list, at this woman who had given birth to me but had never really seen me, and I smiled. "Of course, Mom," I said pleasantly. "I'll be there at 5, whatever Bethany needs." Patricia looked momentarily surprised at my easy agreement, as though Shed expected pushback, but I'd already learned my lesson about arguing with her. It never worked, and it only gave her ammunition to paint me as difficult. Instead, I took the list, kissed her cheek, and left with Garrett. In the car on the way home, I pulled out my phone and made some final edits to the speech I'd been writing and rewriting for the past 2 weeks. I'd shown drafts to both Garrett and Blanche, incorporating their feedback to make it as impactful as possible. The speech was devastating but not cruel. It was factual but not cold. It laid out specific examples with dates and details that couldn't be disputed. It expressed my feelings without being melodramatic. And most importantly, it made clear that this was not a plea for their love or attention, but a statement of boundaries and a final goodbye. I practiced delivering it one more time in front of the bathroom mirror before bed, watching my face remain calm and composed even as my heart raced. Tomorrow, everything would change. I woke up at 4 in the morning on Bethany's wedding day, my alarm pulling me from restless dreams into the pre-dawn darkness. Garrett stirred beside me, reaching out to squeeze my hand in silent support. We'd talked late into the night about what I was planning to do, going over every detail to make sure I was truly ready for the consequences that would follow. "You don't have to do this," Head reminded me one last time before we'd finally fallen asleep. "We can just not go at all. We can protect you from this." But I'd shaken my head firmly. I needed to do this. Needed to speak my truth in a way that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. I got dressed quietly, pulling on jeans and a t-shirt suitable for setup work, and drove to my parents' house to collect the car full of decorations. Patricia had tasked me with transporting to the venue. Sophie and Lucas were still asleep when I left, curled up in their beds, unaware that today was the day they'd been excluded from, the celebration they'd been so excited about months ago. I'd talked to them earlier in the week about why they weren't going to Aunt Bethany's wedding, trying to find words that would help them understand without destroying their sense of worth. Sophie had asked quietly if it was because they'd done something wrong. Lucas had wondered if Aunt Bethany didn't love them anymore. Both questions had broken my heart in ways I couldn't fully express. I'd reassured them that they were perfect exactly as they were, that this wasn't about them at all. But I could see the confusion and hurt in their young faces. Today, I would stand up for them in a way I should have done from the very beginning. At the venue, a beautiful country estate with manicured gardens and an elegant ballroom, I found only 2 other people setting up. One was a staff member from the venue, and the other was a hired coordinator who'd been contracted to manage logistics. I was the only family member there, hauling boxes of decorations and centerpieces from my car, while the morning dew still covered the grass. Patricia arrived at 8, not to help but to supervise and criticize. She walked through the ballroom, pointing out everything it done wrong. The centerpieces were 3 inches too far to the left. The welcome table needed to be angled differently. The guest book was in an area with insufficient lighting. Each criticism was delivered with a sigh that suggested deep disappointment in my incompetence. I fixed everything she pointed out without arguing, saving my words for when they would actually matter. Bethany arrived at 9, looking stressed and demanding, immediately launching into complaints about the florist's work, even though the arrangements were objectively beautiful. I watched her with a strange sense of distance, seeing clearly for the first time how deeply her selfishness ran. This was a woman who'd never been told no, never been required to consider anyone else's feelings, never been held accountable for her cruelty. Patricia had created a monster, and now the whole family was expected to worship at her altar. I left the venue at 10 to go home and prepare myself for the afternoon ceremony. I showered carefully, washing away the physical exhaustion of the morning setup but unable to shake the emotional weight of what was coming. I chose my outfit with care, a beautiful emerald green dress that Garrett had bought me for our anniversary. Elegant but not attention-seeking. Appropriate but not apologetic. I wasn't trying to upstage Bethany or make any kind of statement with my appearance. I simply wanted to look like someone who deserved respect, someone who couldn't be dismissed as frumpy or inferior. I did my makeup more carefully than usual, knowing that I needed to appear composed and confident when I delivered my speech. Garrett got ready beside me, his presence a steady comfort. Before we left, I went into Sophie and Lucas' rooms. They were spending the day with Garrett's parents, who were taking them to a children's museum and then out for pizza, trying to make sure they had fun on a day that should have been special for them. Sophie looked up at me with those serious brown eyes that saw too much for a 7-year-old. "Mom, are you okay?" she asked quietly. I sat on the edge of her bed and pulled her close. "I will be," I promised her. "And you need to know something very important. None of this is your fault. Not one single bit. You and your brother are wonderful, perfect, amazing kids, and anyone who can't see that doesn't deserve to be part of our lives." Lucas bounced over and wrapped his arms around both of us. "Can we have ice cream later?" he asked, his 5-year-old mind already moving past the hurt to the promise of treats. I laughed and kissed the top of his head. "Yes, buddy. We can have all the ice cream you want." As I drove to the venue with Garrett, I felt remarkably calm. The decision was made. The words were prepared. All that remained was following through. And I'd never been more certain of anything in my life. We arrived at 1:30, half an hour before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. The venue had been transformed even further since the morning, with flowers everywhere and elegant white chairs set up in rows facing a beautiful arbor. Guests were beginning to arrive, dressed in their finest clothes and chattering excitedly about the upcoming ceremony. I saw Aunt Francine across the lawn and she caught my eye, giving me a subtle nod of encouragement. She didn't know the specifics of what I was planning, but Shed told me days ago that she supported whatever I decided to do. The ceremony began at 2 o'clock exactly, with a string quartet playing as the wedding party made their entrance. Garrett and I were seated in the very back row, notably not in the family section where my parents sat in the front row alongside Preston's parents. Even at her own daughter's wedding, Patricia couldn't be bothered to include me in the family seating. The ceremony itself was beautiful, I had to admit. Bethany looked stunning in her designer gown, and Preston seemed genuinely smitten as he watched her walk down the aisle. The vows they exchanged were traditional and lovely. For a moment, I felt a pang of something that might have been sadness for what could have been, for the sister relationship we might have had if things had been different. Then I remembered her laughing about my children and the moment passed. After the ceremony concluded and the guests began moving toward the reception area, I took Garrett's hand and we walked together through the gardens. "Last chance to back out," he murmured quietly, though we both knew I wouldn't. "I love you for offering me that out," I replied. "But I need to do this. For Sophie and Lucas. For me. For every person who's ever been made to feel less than by people who should have loved them." We entered the reception hall, a stunning space with crystal chandeliers and tables decorated in ivory and gold. The seating chart directed us to a table in the far corner, as far from the family tables as it was possible to be while still technically being inside the room. We were seated with distant relatives I'd met maybe twice in my life, people who barely knew my name. Meanwhile, Iris and her 3 notoriously badly behaved children were seated at a table much closer to the bride and groom. The irony wasn't lost on me, and I filed it away as another detail to mention if needed. Dinner was served, an elaborate multi-course meal that probably cost more per plate than I spent on groceries in a week. I barely tasted the food, too focused on what was coming to pay attention to flavors or textures. Around us, guests laughed and chatted, celebrating the union of Bethany and Preston with genuine joy. I didn't begrudge them their happiness. Most of these people had no idea what had been happening behind the scenes, no understanding of the cruelty that had brought us to this moment. The toast began after the main course was cleared. Preston's best man stood first, delivering a funny and heartfelt speech about their friendship and how lucky Preston was to have found Bethany. Everyone laughed and applauded. Then Cynthia, the maid of honor who had humiliated me at the bridal shower, gave a gushing speech about how Bethany was the most elegant and sophisticated woman she'd ever known, how she set the standard for grace and beauty. I watched her deliver this praise and remembered her calculated cruelty, the way she'd publicly mocked the exclusion of my children. More applause followed, and then my father stood. Howard's speech was everything I'd expected and worse. He talked about his little princess, his perfect daughter, how proud he was of the woman she'd become. He praised her taste, her judgment, her ability to know exactly what she wanted and make it happen. He welcomed Preston into the family with genuine warmth, and through all of it, he never once mentioned me, never acknowledged that he had another daughter sitting in the back of the room. It was as though I didn't exist, as though Bethany was an only child who'd been the sole recipient of their love and attention. When he finished, Patricia dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, crying tears of joy over her favorite child's perfect day. The microphone was then opened up for anyone else who wanted to share words. "Anyone else want to say a few words about the happy couple?" the DJ announced cheerfully. This was the moment. I stood up slowly, my legs steadier than I'd expected them to be. Garrett squeezed my hand one more time before releasing it, and I walked toward the front of the room. I could see Patricia's face registering alarm as she realized what was happening, but it was too late to stop me without causing the very scene she'd been trying to avoid all day. I reached the microphone and took a breath, looking out at the assembled guests. Some faces were curious, some confused, and some, like Aunt Francine's, were knowing and supportive. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice calm and clear through the sound system. "For those who don't know me, my name is Mallory, and am Bethany's older sister. I wanted to take a moment to share some thoughts on this beautiful day." I saw Bethany's expression shift from confusion to concern, saw Preston lean over to whisper something to her. I continued before anyone could interrupt. "This truly has been a beautiful wedding. The flowers are stunning, the venue is elegant, and the love between Bethany and Preston is evident to everyone here. I can see how much work went into creating this perfect day, and I want to acknowledge that." I paused, letting that genuine compliment sink in before I shifted direction. Family is complicated, isn't it? Today I've been thinking a lot about what family means, about the sacrifices we make for the people we love, about how we show up for each other, even when it's difficult or inconvenient. I saw a few people nodding, thinking I was going somewhere sweet and sentimental. Over the past few months, I've spent considerable time and energy supporting this wedding. 2 weekends ago, I spent 12 hours making the centerpieces you see on these tables, addressing invitations, and assembling welcome bags. This morning, I arrived at this venue at 5 o'clock to set up decorations while most of you were still sleeping. I've run errands, made phone calls, solved problems, and done everything asked of me. More nods from the audience, and I could see Patricia relaxing slightly, probably thinking I was building to some kind of tribute. I did all of this happily, because that's what family does. We show up, we support each other, we put aside our own needs to help the people we love celebrate their important moments. Then I let the other shoe drop. But I have to be honest about something that's been weighing on my heart. My 2 children, Sophie, who is 7 years old, and Lucas, who is 5, were banned from attending this wedding. Not because of budget constraints or limited space, not because of a general adults-only policy that applied to all children equally. They were specifically excluded because, and I'm quoting my mother here, they would ruin the sophisticated atmosphere that Bethany wanted. The gasps that rippled through the crowd were audible. I saw several heads turn toward Patricia, whose face had gone pale. I kept going, my voice still measured and calm. My children are not misbehaved. They're not wild or disruptive. Sophie is a quiet, thoughtful child who loves to read. Lucas is energetic but well-mannered and responsive to direction. They were heartbroken when I told them they couldn't come to their aunt's wedding. They asked me if they'd done something wrong, if Aunt Bethany didn't love them anymore. I saw several women in the audience putting their hands to their mouths, clearly moved by this image. And what hurts most is that this isn't really about the wedding at all. It's about a pattern I've watched my entire life. I kept my tone factual, not angry or bitter, just truthful. When I turned 16, I was told I could share the old family car. When Bethany turned 16 3 years later, she was surprised with a brand new Honda with a bow on it. I went to community college and state school on student loans I'm still paying off. Bethany's private university education was fully funded by our parents. My wedding 8 years ago received a contribution of $1,500. This wedding received over $60,000. The numbers landed like bombs. I could see people doing the math in their heads, their expressions shifting from confusion to understanding. I'm not saying this to ruin anyone's day or to take away from the celebration. I'm saying it because I finally realized something important. I deserve better. My children deserve better. Silence protects the people who hurt us while punishing those who are hurt. Bethany had started crying, her perfect makeup streaking down her face. Preston looked bewildered, clearly not fully understanding what was happening. Patricia was standing now, trying to signal to me to stop, but I wasn't finished. The truth is, I've spent 34 years trying to earn love and approval from people who had already decided I wasn't worth it. I've accepted crumbs and called them feasts. I've tolerated cruelty and called it family. But watching my children be rejected and mocked, hearing my mother and sister laugh about how undisciplined they supposedly are, being told by family friends that my parents have been spreading lies about behavioral issues that don't exist. That was the moment I realized I had to stop participating in my own diminishment. The room was completely silent now except for the sound of Bethany's sobbing. So Bethany, I genuinely wish you and Preston every happiness. I hope your marriage is filled with love and respect and partnership. Mom, Dad, I hope you understand why this is the last family event you'll be attending. I'm done accepting less than I deserve. I'm done allowing my children to be treated as lesser members of this family. I looked around the room one more time, making eye contact with various relatives and family friends. To everyone else here, thank you for listening. If you've ever felt overlooked or undervalued by the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally, please know you're not alone. And please, hug your children tonight and tell them they matter. Tell them they're worthy of love and respect exactly as they are. I set the microphone down carefully and walked away from the head table. Behind me, chaos erupted immediately. Patricia's voice rose in a screech that could probably be heard outside the building. Bethany was full-on wailing now, and various relatives were shouting questions and comments. But I didn't turn around. Garrett met me halfway across the room and we walked out together, leaving the perfect wedding in shambles behind us. As we stepped out into the parking lot, I heard Aunt Francine's voice calling my name. She hurried over and pulled me into a fierce hug. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen," she whispered. "I'm so proud of you." Then she pressed a piece of paper into my hand with her phone number. "Call me anytime. You and those babies will always be welcome in my home." The drive away from the venue felt surreal, like I was floating outside my body watching events unfold. My hands shook on the steering wheel, adrenaline finally catching up with me now that the speech was over. Garrett reached over and placed his hand on my knee, grounding me in the present moment. "You did it," he said quietly. "You actually did it." We drove straight to his parents' house to pick up Sophie and Lucas. They came running to the door covered in pizza sauce and museum stickers, chattering excitedly about the giant dinosaur skeleton they'd seen and the ice cream they'd been promised. They had no idea that their mother had just burned down decades of family relationships to defend their worth. I gathered them both into my arms and held on tight, breathing in the scent of their shampoo and feeling their solid, real presence. These were the people who mattered. These were the relationships worth protecting. My phone started buzzing before we even made it home, message after message flooding in as news of the speech spread among the guests, and then to extended family who hadn't been present. I waited until Sophie and Lucas were in bed before I finally looked at the damage. From Patricia, there were 17 text messages in rapid succession, each one escalating in fury. The first few called me ungrateful and selfish. The middle ones accused me of deliberately destroying Bethany's wedding day. The final ones were just incoherent rage, strings of accusations that barely made grammatical sense. She called me vindictive, cruel, jealous, petty, and half a dozen other insults. Not once did she acknowledge any of the specific examples I'd given. Not once did she admit that any of what I'd said was true. It was all about how I'd embarrassed them, how I'd made them look bad in front of their friends and Preston's family. Howard's messages were fewer but somehow more cutting in their coldness. Head sent 3 texts, each one formal and distant as though he were communicating with a business associate rather than his daughter. The first demanded that I apologize immediately to Bethany and all the wedding guests. The second stated that my behavior was unforgivable and had brought shame on the entire family. The third was a simple ultimatum: apologize by tomorrow morning or consider yourself disowned. I read that final message several times, looking for any hint of love or pain or even anger, but there was nothing. Just cold dismissal, as though cutting off his daughter was as simple as firing an unsatisfactory employee. From Bethany, there was a single voice message. I almost didn't listen to it, but morbid curiosity won out. Her voice was hoarse from crying, barely coherent through the sobbing. "How could you do this to me?" she wailed. "This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life and you ruined it. You stood up there and humiliated me in front of everyone I care about. I'll never forgive you for this. Never. You're not my sister anymore. You're nothing to me." The messages from Iris were predictably nasty, defending our parents and calling me dramatic. But there were other messages too, ones I hadn't expected. Aunt Francine had texted, "You are so brave. That needed to be said. Come have lunch with me next week." 3 of my cousins, who had always been friendly with but never particularly close to, had also reached out. "We had no idea it was this bad," one wrote. "Your parents always acted like everything was fine, but hearing those specific examples, we believe you." Another said simply, "You did the right thing. Some of us have been watching this favoritism for years, and it wasn't fair." Most surprising was a message from Ramona, the family friend who'd mentioned my children's supposed behavioral issues at the dress shop. "Your mother lied to me about your children," she wrote. "I'm so sorry," I repeated what she told me. "I feel terrible that I contributed to this situation. Your kids are wonderful, and you were right to stand up for them." Over the next few days, I blocked my parents' numbers and Bethany's as well. I couldn't handle the constant barrage of guilt-tripping and accusations. The extended family split into factions, with some taking my parents' side and insisting I should apologize for embarrassing them publicly, while others quietly reached out to express support. I learned from a sympathetic cousin that the remainder of the wedding reception had been incredibly awkward, with Patricia trying to make excuses for my speech while Bethany remained hysterical. Apparently, several guests had left early, and others had been overhead discussing whether the favoritism I'd described was really as bad as I'd claimed. The family was divided, and while that was painful in some ways, it was also liberating. I'd spent so long pretending everything was fine, maintaining a facade of family harmony, that I'd forgotten what honesty felt like. The 8th attack came 2 days after the wedding when Patricia showed up at my house unannounced. I looked through the peephole and saw her standing on my porch, her expression a mixture of righteous anger and practiced victimhood. I considered not answering, but Garrett was home with me and I knew she'd just keep knocking. I opened the door but didn't invite her in. "We need to talk," Patricia announced, as though she had any right to make demands of me. "No, we don't," I replied calmly. "You've had 34 years to talk to me with honesty and respect. You chose not to." She tried to push past me into the house, but I blocked her path. Her strategy shifted immediately from aggression to manipulation. "How could you do this to your sister?" she demanded, her voice taking on that wounded tone that had always worked to make me feel guilty in the past. "Do you have any idea how many people were at that wedding? Everyone thinks we're terrible parents now. You've destroyed our reputation in the community." Notice what she didn't say. She didn't say we're sorry for how we treated you. She didn't say we were wrong to exclude your children. She didn't even say we love you and want to make this right. It was all about reputation, about how they looked to others, about protecting their image. "Mom, I told the truth. I said simply, if the truth makes you look bad, that's not my fault. That's yours." She tried another tactic, her eyes filling with tears that looked practiced rather than genuine. "Everyone thinks we're monsters," she said, her voice breaking. "Your father is devastated." Bethany cried for hours. "You've torn this family apart." I felt that old familiar pull, the lifetime of conditioning that told me I was responsible for everyone else's feelings, that keeping the peace was more important than standing up for myself. But this time, I recognized it for what it was and I resisted. "I didn't tear this family apart," I replied. "This family was broken long before I said anything. I just stopped pretending it was fine." Patricia's expression hardened when she realized guilt wasn't going to work. "You're going to regret this," she said coldly. "When your father and I are gone, you'll wish you'd made peace with us. You'll be left with nothing but guilt and regret." It was meant to be a devastating warning, a threat designed to make me reconsider. Instead, I felt almost sorry for her. She genuinely believed that was true, that her approval and presence in my life were so valuable that it'd be destroyed without them. "Mom, I regret a lot of things," I told her honestly. "I regret not standing up for myself sooner. I regret letting you treat my children like second-class family members. I regret wasting so many years trying to earn love that was never actually available to me. But I won't regret this." She opened her mouth to argue, but I gently closed the door in her face. I watched through the window as she stood there for a long moment before finally walking back to her car, her shoulders stiff with indignation. The ninth attack came a week later in the form of a formal letter delivered by certified mail. Howard had always preferred written communication for important matters, believing it gave him more authority and control. I signed for the envelope, already knowing it wouldn't contain an apology or an olive branch. Inside was a single typed page on official letterhead from their estate attorney. The language was cold and legal, informing me that I was being removed from their will and banned from all future family gatherings. Any inheritance I might have expected was being redirected entirely to Bethany. I was not to contact them, not to visit their home, and not to attend any family events, including future weddings, funerals, or holiday celebrations. It was framed as punishment, as the ultimate consequence for my unforgivable behavior. They'd probably expected me to panic, to beg for forgiveness, to realize what I was losing and come crawling back. Instead, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. They'd just given me a gift more valuable than any inheritance. They'd released me from obligation. I didn't have to show up to holidays and pretend anymore. I didn't have to endure subtle digs and blatant favoritism. I didn't have to watch my children be treated as lesser. I was free. 3 weeks after the wedding, Bethany returned from her honeymoon and immediately posted photos on social media. She and Preston looked happy and tanned, posing on beaches and in front of European landmarks. But it was her caption that drew attention. She wrote a long paragraph about how marriage was teaching her the importance of real family, of people who genuinely support you, versus fake family members who smile to your face while harboring jealousy and resentment. She talked about how Shed learned to cut toxic people out of her life, even when they share your DNA. She never mentioned me by name, but everyone knew exactly who she was talking about. The comments section became a battlefield. Several of Patricia's friends left sympathetic messages supporting Bethany and condemning people who would ruin such a special day out of jealousy. But there were other comments, too. Relatives who'd been at the wedding and witnessed my speech defended me, pointing out that I'd simply told the truth. Aunt Francine left a comment that said only sometimes the truth is uncomfortable, but that doesn't make it any less true. I didn't respond or engage with any of it. I'd said what I needed to say, and I had no interest in continuing the drama on social media. 2 months after the wedding, I sat in a therapist's office and talked about my family for the first time, with complete honesty. Dr. Helen Martinez listened as I described the lifetime of favoritism, the recent escalation around the wedding, and my decision to finally speak up publicly. When I finished, she nodded thoughtfully. "You're describing a classic family dynamic with a designated golden child and scapegoat," she explained. Bethany was assigned the role of the perfect one, the child who could do no wrong and whose needs always came first. You were cast as the responsible one, the child who was expected to support and accommodate without complaint. These roles were assigned in childhood and reinforced throughout your life. Hearing those terms, golden child and scapegoat, was like finally having a map for territory I'd been wandering through blind. It wasn't that I was fundamentally unlovable or that Bethany was inherently more valuable. It was a dysfunctional family system that had required both roles to function. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that my parents' favoritism was never about my worth. It was about their own needs and limitations as parents. Without the constant weight of trying to please my parents and manage their expectations, I had so much more energy for the relationships that actually mattered. Sophie and Lucas were thriving without the confusion of grandparents who sometimes showed interest and sometimes treated them as burdens. Garrett told me repeatedly that he'd never seen me this confident, this at peace with myself. The knot of anxiety I'd carried in my chest for as long as I could remember had loosened and then disappeared entirely. I started pursuing hobbies I'd abandoned years ago, taking an art class at the community center and joining a book club with other mothers from Sophie's school. I made new friends who didn't know anything about my family history, who simply liked me for who I was, without any complicated baggage. Aunt Francine became a surrogate grandmother to Sophie and Lucas, showing up for school events and birthday parties with genuine enthusiasm. Several cousins who'd sided with me started including us in their own family gatherings, creating a new definition of family based on mutual respect rather than obligation. 4 months after the wedding, I received an unexpected email from Bethany. The subject line read simply, "Checking in," and I almost deleted it without reading, assuming it was another attack. But curiosity got the better of me. The email wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it wasn't hostile either. "Marriage is harder than I expected." Shed written. "Preston's family isn't as welcoming as I thought they'd be. His mother has very specific ideas about how things should be done and she's not shy about sharing her opinions. I'm starting to understand what it feels like to not be the favorite, to have to work for approval instead of having it automatically. I guess I took for granted that you'd always be there, that I could treat you however I wanted and you'd just keep showing up." She went on to say that she wasn't ready to talk yet, that she was still hurt about the wedding speech, but that maybe someday we could find a way forward. It was the closest thing to accountability I'd ever gotten from her, this admission that she'd taken me for granted and was now experiencing some small taste of what I'd lived with my entire life. I read the email 3 times, feeling a complicated mixture of emotions. Part of me wanted to respond, to take this tiny olive branch and try to rebuild some kind of relationship. But the wiser part of me, the part that had been growing stronger over these months of therapy and self-work, recognized that this wasn't real change. Bethany was reaching out because she was struggling and wanted support, not because she'd genuinely examined her behavior or was prepared to make amends. She was treating me as a backup plan, someone to turn to now that her perfect life wasn't quite as perfect as she'd expected. I saved the email but didn't respond. Maybe someday I'd be ready to have a conversation with her, but it would have to be on my terms, with real accountability and changed behavior, not just words. I wasn't interested in being her emotional support system while she continued to benefit from our parents' favoritism and resources. If she wanted a relationship with me, she'd have to earn it. 6 months after the wedding, Howard had a minor health scare, ending up in the hospital overnight with what turned out to be a false alarm about his heart. Patricia called from a number I hadn't blocked, probably using a friend's phone, expecting me to rush to their side the way I'd always done before. "Your father is in the hospital," she said without preamble when I answered, not recognizing the number. We need you here. There was an expectation in her voice, a certainty that this emergency would override all boundaries and bring me running back into the fold. For a moment, I felt that old familiar panic, the conditioning of a lifetime screaming at me that good daughters show up during medical crises. Then I took a breath and responded calmly. I hope Dad recovers quickly, I said sincerely. But I won't be coming to the hospital. You made it clear I'm no longer part of the family. That has to go both ways. Patricia's shocked silence spoke volumes. Shed genuinely believed that all she had to do was summon me, and it'd come, that family obligation would override my boundaries. When she found her voice, it was filled with disbelief. How can you be so cold? She demanded. Hes your father, and im his daughter, I replied. The one he disowned in writing, im simply respecting the boundary he established. I hung up and blocked that number too. The most important lesson I learned through all of this was about the difference between family and people who happen to be related to you. Real family shows up for each other. Real family celebrates successes and supports each other through failures. Real family doesn't require you to diminish yourself to make others comfortable. Sophie and Lucas would grow up knowing their worth because I'd shown them that standing up for yourself isn't cruel or selfish, it's necessary. They would see their mother set boundaries and maintain them, even when it was difficult. They would learn that love doesn't mean tolerating mistreatment, that loyalty doesn't require silence in the face of injustice. 1 year after the wedding, we celebrated Sophie's 8th birthday with a party in our backyard. Garrett's family was there, along with Aunt Francine, the cousins who'd supported me, and a dozen of Sophie's school friends. The house was full of laughter and chaos, wrapping paper and birthday cake. Sophie blew out her candles and looked up at me with pure joy, completely unaware that her maternal grandparents weren't there and not missing them at all. Lucas was playing tag with his cousins, his laughter ringing out across the yard. Garrett came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist as we watched our children playing. Any regrets? He asked quietly, though I knew he already knew the answer. Not a single one, I replied honestly. This is what family is supposed to feel like. The grief was real, and I'd done the work to acknowledge it in therapy. I'd grieved for the parents I'd wished I had, for the childhood I deserved but never got, for the sister relationship that could have been but never was. That grief would probably always be there in some form, a scar that ached occasionally but no longer controlled my life. But the freedom I'd gained was worth every moment of pain. I'd broken a cycle that had probably been going on for generations. Sophie and Lucas would never question their worth the way I had questioned mine. They would grow up knowing that they deserved respect and kindness, that they should never accept crumbs and call them love. Sometimes people ask me if I think the wedding speech was too harsh, too public, too dramatic. They suggest I should have handled it privately, that I should have just quietly distanced myself without making a scene. But I know in my bones that quiet wouldn't have worked. I'd tried quiet for 34 years. I'd tried private conversations and carefully worded concerns and gentle boundary setting, and none of it had made a difference. The only thing that worked was speaking truth loudly enough that it couldn't be ignored or rewritten. Yes, I embarrassed my parents and disrupted Bethany's wedding, but they'd spent decades embarrassing me and disrupting my peace of mind. They'd excluded my children from a family event and then expected me to help create that event with a smile on my face. The wedding speech wasn't revenge in the sense of hurting them the way they'd hurt me. It was about refusing to be hurt anymore. It was about standing up and saying clearly, this stops now. Not because I hated them, but because I loved myself and my children more than I feared their rejection. They say that living well is the best revenge, and there's truth in that. But I learned something even more important. Living authentically, speaking your truth even when it costs you, protecting your boundaries even when people call you selfish, that's the best form of self-love. My parents banned my children from my sister's wedding because they didn't value us enough to include us in the celebration. So I banned their dysfunction from my life, refusing to participate in a system that required me to accept less than I deserved. I walked away from people who made me feel small and walked toward people who helped me grow. I traded obligation for authenticity, pretense for peace, And I've never looked back. Not with regret, but with profound gratitude that I finally found the strength to choose myself and my children over their approval. That choice, made in a moment of courage at an elegantly decorated wedding reception, gave us all the gift of freedom. And that freedom, that peace, that certainty of our own worth, is something no inheritance or family gathering could ever replace. So here's my question for all of you watching. Have you ever had to stand up to family members who didn't value you? Have you experienced favoritism or been made to feel less than by people who were supposed to love you unconditionally? Drop your story in the comments below because I know I'm not alone in this, and maybe sharing our experiences can help others who are still struggling to find their voice. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Your support means everything, and it helps these stories reach people who need to hear them. Share this video with someone who might need the courage to set their own boundaries. And most importantly, remember that you deserve respect, kindness, and genuine love. You deserve to be more than someone's afterthought or backup plan. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I hope wherever you are in your own journey, you find the strength to stand up for yourself and the people you love, sending you all courage, peace, and the certainty of your own incredible worth. You matter. Your feelings matter, and you deserve so much better than crumbs.